Howdy, welcome back. Today I'm going to go over a few of the steps I've taken care of in the model so far. As you can see, I've got my instructions, lower hull, and this here box. And according to the instructions, first thing to do is the muffler, so forth, and the back plate. And I've already put those together, and I'm just going to show you a little something. This little box here, I use this for holding smaller parts as I'm building them. That way it keeps them neat and together. As you can see, I've already put all the wheels together. Well, most of them. I'm going to show you some other ones here pretty soon. The back plate, the muffler. What I want to talk about on the muffler first, since it's the first part, is one of the things you will see is there's a seam on both sides of the muffler. Now I've already removed the seam on this side compared to this one, and this is a case where, as I talked about in my basic tool video, where clamps come in handy. What I did is I put the parts together and then I clamped them thusly to hold them in place, then using my Tamiya extra thin, I merely touched the seams and allowed the cement to run down the joint, as I mentioned, through capillary action. So then once it's dry, you can take the clamps off, and when you clamp it, you can manipulate your in this case clothespins, to hold it in such a way that it's as lined up as possible. That way you have less cleanup to mess with. So then, after you get it all glued together, there'll be like a little ridge along the edge where the seam is. And the way I handle that is with the edge of my knife blade. And all I do is gently scrape like this where that seam is. Hold it at kind of a backwards angle, and then just scrape it like that, and the seam will disappear. And if you do it correctly without just going straight up and down, but kind of alternate along the curve of the cylinder here, it will maintain its cylindrical shape without having a flat spot. So that's how I clean that up. So then once I got it together, I put it aside. The next part was the back plate. Just a few parts, pretty basic. Take the parts off, clean them up. And right here is a case where it was a better idea to use my thicker cement, the one with the dandy applicator tip, because it dries slower. And what I did is I put a dab of glue on, then placed the part and positioned it, and then just let it dry. Same with these little lever looking parts right here. I did the same thing. Put a little dab of glue, then using my tweezers, just set the part in place. And because that cement dries a little slower, I can position it the way it's supposed to be, and then just set it aside and it dries. So that's pretty easy. The next step was the wheels, and I will show you how I handled that. Now, as you can see, I've already put all the wheels together. What I do, I left one on here to use as an example. So I'm going to center this up a little bit more so you can see what I'm talking about. This white background. Take your handy dandy cutters, and as close to the part as possible, give it a little clip. And you may not be able to see it, but I'll try. You'll still have just like a little mark there where the sprue attaches to the part. And you can probably also see there is a seam running the circumference of the wheel. So what I do is I take my knife and I trim that little bit of plastic off like that, and then using the same action as I did with the on the muffler, you just drag your knife across that seam and it'll flatten it out. So when you paint it and weather it, you won't see a mold seam. So hopefully you can see right there. It's a little better. Okay, so that's that. Then after you've done that, you take, calls for 2 parts. That part, actually 3 parts. That part, the vinyl part that slides onto the axle goes in there. Then you put the 2 halves together, take your cement and touch the brush to the inside of the seam and it'll glue it together. And there's another part that goes right on top. Voila, wheel is done. So that is pretty much that. The next part that you have to deal with, and I'm not going to go over all these steps every time, but there's just a few notes on some of these parts that are worth talking about. For example, the drive sprockets. Same thing. Cut your part as close as you can, straight as you can. Then you take the drive sprocket, and again, I don't know if you can see it very well, but there is a mold seam on the inside of these teeth. This is a little bit more tedious, but you use the same method. Scrape in between there thusly, in between the teeth, and then up each tooth. Get all those mold seams off. Then get the loose plastic off, and you'll be ready to go. You have to do it around the whole, every tooth on here and on the other half. Okay, so basically I'd say that's some things to look for, or look for when doing those parts. One more quick item. I've already glued all these parts on the lower hull. It's very basic, so the instructions are self-explanatory there. But one thing to note, in the original version of this that you could put a motor, you could either make it as a static model using this part here, or this part here, where the axle would run through for the motorized version. Obviously we're not using these, so we use those. So just another thing to look for when you're building one of these kits. So I think that is it. We'll come back in a few minutes and check on some of the other steps. Okay, I am back, and it is now time to go over some final notes on assembly. A few things I wanted to point out. One thing I would suggest, and some people may do it differently, but what I like to do is, as I'm building the model and I'm going through the instructions, as I build parts, I like to circle them. And if for some reason I'm not going to build a part at this particular time, whether I'm changing up, if I'm going to build, install it later, which I'll give you an example in a minute, I won't circle it. That way I know if it's not circled, I still need to go over my instructions, and I know if I see something that's not circled, I'll know it still needs to be installed for whatever reason. For example, on the lower hull, I've actually assembled all of the wheels, but I haven't actually installed them. And the reason for that is whenever I paint the model, I like to do it without the wheels on, so it's a little bit easier to get everything in here painted and then weathered without having to try and get around wheels and sprockets and so forth. So that's one thing I have not installed. And another thing I have not installed is the muffler system. You have the main muffler, you have the smoke dischargers that go on the muffler, and then the auxiliary generator muffler. None of that has been installed on the back plate. It goes on here, something like this. But the reason I haven't installed it yet is because I want to paint it the rust color, and I want to do that while it's off the vehicle. That way it'll be a lot easier to paint. So I can paint it the rust color, then install it, and I'll be good to go. Let's see, so that takes care of that. Now, early on I had mentioned that one of the things you really need to do whenever you're building a model, especially if you can build different versions out of the same kit, is you want to make sure you choose which version you want to build. Now in my case, I chose to build the early version of this tank. And the main reason I chose to do the early version is for no other reason other than I want to use the solid white national insignia on the vehicle instead of the white outline or the black with white outline national insignia. I've never built a kit like that. I've never built one in gray, and I figured I'd do the early version. So that's why I chose that. With that in mind, as you read through the instructions, it will tell you when to use different parts according to the version you're going to do. For example, step 6 here is the upper hull, and a couple of the items you need to install are the engine, the back engine covers. Okay, the parts that are notated in this particular step are C11 and C17. There's a notation right here that says do not use C11 and C17 when the African version will be assembled. Okay, so if I were doing the African version, I would use the other engine covers. These are solid. The ones for the African version are louvered. Okay, but I didn't use those because I'm not doing the African version. Okay, another note on step 7. All of step 7 is pretty much for the late version. The difference between the late version and the early version is the additional application of armor plate. There's some bolt-on armor plate that was installed on the later versions, and since I'm not doing that version, I won't be installing it. So pretty much all of number 7 I'm not using. Step 7, so I cross it out, that way I know. Another item is the back. There is a stowage shelf that fits on the back of the vehicle, and for instance, the louvered engine covers are noted D6, D12, D21, D13 are all the parts for that. Those numbers are listed right here. It says will be used in the African version. Okay, then this back shelf, the parts D8, D16, D9, D17, list those. It says will not be used on the early version. So since I'm doing the early version, I won't build those. So this whole step 7, cross it out, not using it. Okay, so that's just a notation on why it is important to read the instructions thoroughly, decide which version you want to build, and familiarize yourself with what's on the instructions. Okay, pretty much that is it. I've done I build my parts in sub-assemblies. Like the turret, I've got it all pretty much done except for the open hatch. I'm not going to install that just yet. I haven't installed the turret roof. The reason being is I want to paint the interior of this before I put the top on, just to make it easier to paint. So pretty much all of the assembly is done, and I'm actually ready to begin painting. So the next part of this video is going to talk a little bit about the painting and what I'm going to do to prep for that, and how I'm actually going to paint the kit. Alright, so that's it for now, and I'll get back to you later. Okay, this is the wrap up for the building portion of this model. All the construction has been completed. I have not glued this into place because I want to paint. As I mentioned in the last little segment, I was going to start talking about painting, but I think I'm going to start a new video for that, so I can just get into the details of painting the kit. But the top part of the hull is not attached. It's just set in place right now, again, to make it easier to paint underneath here. And then once I get everything painted, before I start weathering, I'll actually put this part together. I'll be painting the inside of the turret, and I'm leaving the top off just to make that a little easier. But all the construction is done, all the components are assembled, so I can start priming and painting, and then move on to weathering. Just a few thoughts about this model so far. It's all went together perfectly well, with no problems. The only parts I haven't assembled are the tools, a few of the brackets and stuff like that that go on the outside of the tank, again just for ease of painting. And I'll be painting those separately with a brush. It's just easier to paint detail parts and then install them, for me anyway. A lot of people put the whole thing together and then do it. So anyway, the kit is complete, and my next video will concentrate on priming and painting, and then I'll probably move on to weathering. So that concludes the assembly portion of this project, and I'll see you next time.